all the way back like 160 degrees, almost 180 degrees back towards the vagina. Okay, so that's what happens when you have an empty bladder. So when you get a full bladder, you get much better sort of view here using the bladder as your acoustic window. When we move the probe into a transverse plane and a full bladder, now we see this rectangular shaped instead of triangular shaped. In a transverse plane, the bladder is rectangular shaped, and we see the uterus lying posterior to it, this being that vesico-uterine pouch or anterior cul-de-sac. Back here is the recto-uterine pouch or posterior cul-de-sac. And when there's a cyst on the ovary transabdominally, sometimes we can make out where it is. Very hard to see, if not impossible, to see the ovaries in a transabdominal approach. This is what happens when you have an empty bladder or a very almost empty bladder in a transverse plane. Things look really confusing. Okay, so you can imagine this is the vaginal area down here. Vaginal vault is down here. This is the empty bladder, and this is the fundus of the uterus up here. And so the uterus sort of went behind the screen into the wall and then back out towards the screen again behind this empty bladder. And I think the anatomy is a little bit confusing when you have a really sharply anteverted uterus, and the reason it's so sharply anteverted, again, is the empty bladder. So try to scan these uteri in when you've got full bladders. It makes the anatomy much easier to conceptualize, I think. And it's critical to have an empty bladder. If you don't have an empty bladder, what happens is you get all these artifacts. You see all this artifactual stuff over here? That's this stuff coming over here and causing artifact and obscuring the gestational sac. Unfortunately, I cannot make any sense out of what's going on in that gestational sac. We have to stop the ultrasound. The patient has to go void again, and therein lies the problem. So you got to have an empty bladder.
You have a catheter right there on the table?
I have not done that before. If it was indicated, I might do it. If the patient was too sick, or they're unstable, I'm worried about an ectopic pregnancy, but there's too much urine in the bladder, that's a good thought. At that point, I would just have the nurse, maybe there's a catheter in the room already, hopefully. If not, if the nurse has to leave to get one, I'm in the middle of my pelvic ultrasound, I'm going to have to stop the ultrasound because now I don't have my chaperone. So it kind of depends on, that's why it's nice to have an extra person, an extra chaperone in the room, not just using the nurse as your chaperone, because in an unstable patient, because you may need more supplies in the middle of this that a nurse may have to run to grab and go and get. So it's good to have an extra person in the room act as your chaperone. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this schematic and I'm going to rotate it to demonstrate